Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming out on a warm, dry evening like tonight. And it's good to know St Andrews doesn't leak anymore. So it's a great pleasure to have Alex Bremner here and talking on a really nice and serious topic, which I think has something to do with the paper that he talked about at a conference I was at. But it was fortuitous that we then got in touch. I first got in touch with him to ask him to referee an application to the Paul Mellon Centre in the UK for some preservation of our architectural drawings at Wits. And he wrote such a nice review that we actually got the grant. And I realise now that the reason that they took him so seriously was he had in turn been a postdoctoral fellow at the same centre earlier on. So just shows, it's who you know, right? So he is, you'll pick up within a few minutes of listening to him that he's actually from Australia originally. And he went to the UK to do his PhD at Cambridge University, and then subsequently has joined the architecture department at the University of Edinburgh, where he has chalked up some very remarkable awards. The book, and I just need this to read the title, his monograph, Imperial Gothic, Religious Architecture and High Anglican Culture in the British Empire, 1840 to 70, was published by Yale University Press, and it received the Alice Davis Hitchcock Medallion for 2013 from the Society of Architectural Historians of Great Britain, the Historians of British Art Book Prize, and there's another one, the William M.B. Berger Prize for British Art History, and was shortlisted for the Whitfield Prize, British Historical Society, which is really quite extraordinary. And he's also on the editorial board of ABE Journal, which is a fantastic journal. If you read in architectural history, please look it up. It's online and open access and very high standard, amongst other things. And I'm going to stop here. I want to quickly say that over and above this being the first event that we are organising in relation to this grant and this archive that we have at Wits, we would love to use your details again to invite you to other events which are probably more likely to be at Wits. It's also very nice to be able to tie two things together. And the one is the sort of heritage of the Rand, the Witwatersrand, the early Rand, and buildings like St Andrews, which have typically been seen as sort of heritage gems relating to a sort of colonial project, but have not really been seen that critically. And Alex's work concerning coal is a way of also understanding that this building is also tied to an ecological regime which has brought its own problems. We tend to see colonial architecture in two prisms. One is perhaps as a kind of highly exploitative, extractive problem, and the other one is a kind of, remnant of British greatness in the past. And I find that his work actually spans between these positions, these fairly extreme positions, in a way that's very thought-provoking and very important as we try and give ammunition to the fight to make architectural history relevant today. So thank you for the topic, thank you for joining us, and for writing that nice letter down the line.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Before I start, what are the acoustics like in here? I need it, so I can't. Okay, fine. That's fine. That's absolutely fine. Thank you very much, Hannah, for that introduction. Thank you for the invitation to be here. In fact, I didn't think I was going to make it. My flight was rather delayed, but I'm here, which is great. And I promised I didn't bring the bad weather, even though I'm from the UK. I came from Durban this time. Just before I sort of get onto the topic proper, as it were, what I should say, I guess, by way of introduction, is to say a little something about where this talk comes from, where it sort of stems from, as it were. So it stems from the premise that I think, and I hope you'll agree, that there is too little discussion of climate change and the challenges that humanity faces in that regard. Too little of that discussion affect our teaching of architectural history. We live, we are told, in the age of the Anthropocene, and whether you believe that or recognise it or buy into it, or not, the effects of climate change, I think, are evident for all to see, whether that be in terms of pollution of myriad forms, or rising temperatures, or rising sea levels, and so on and so forth. In a sense, there's no way of really escaping from climate change, I think. Now, some of you will know there has been discussion, in fact quite a lot of discussion over the past decade or so, on how to broaden the teaching of architectural history beyond the Western canon, especially in schools of architecture. Globalisation of the curriculum at survey level has come to dominate that discussion, with a growing number of new textbooks in that area, as well as at least one international forum dedicated to supporting that initiative. Now, as laudable and successful as that initiative has been, what I think remains largely absent from the discussion, as I was saying, is how to address the most serious dilemma currently facing humanity, that is catastrophic climate change. If we are, I think, to have any hope at all of averting this disaster, then awareness of the issues must be inculcated at every level in architectural education, including in architectural history. With that in mind, our social and environmental responsibilities, as it were, both as scholars and as teachers and indeed as students and members of the public, necessarily go hand in hand, I believe. And such an agenda necessitates going beyond an awareness of what we tend to call green architecture and history of pre-industrial passive forms of building. These are, of course, important to a wide and balanced and environmentally conscious historiography, but are not, I think, in and of themselves balanced, capable of foregrounding and therefore confronting, as it were, the historical nexus between architecture and energy consumption. Crucially, this nexus must be understood not just at the level of design and function and use in buildings, but also with regard to production, transportation, and assemblage. Embodied energy, as you'll know, is a key index to the true energy costs of building. Only when the various chains and networks of procurement and supply are taken fully into account can the carbon footprint of building production be properly appreciated and properly understood. Now, awareness of these factors, as you may know, and certainly in schools of architecture and the profession as a whole, have informed contemporary practice for quite some time, but they ought, I think, also to form the basis of new modes of the historical understanding of architecture, leading to an interpretation of architecture as a material object in a kind of thermodynamic sense. And when I say this, I'm not trying to suggest that this kind of history or approach should supplant our cultural understanding of architecture. That's, of course, very important, but simply to add another layer, another dimension to it, because, of course, architects were well aware of the material choices that they were making, I think, right throughout history. But for such an agenda in teaching to take hold, I think there needs to be a parallel reform and development in the historiography of architecture, with the advent of new forms of scholarship that treat energy inputs and consumption as an analytical category in the historical understanding of built form. So that's the premise of where what I'm about to talk about comes from. That is the motivation, so to speak, to bring the idea of energy back to the core, to the heart of architectural history, and bring it to the fore. And so what follows is a modest contribution to what such a history might actually look like, focusing on a particular moment in time, that being the Victorian age in Britain, and a particular source of energy in that being coal. Now, what I have to say applies to Britain, but it could, I think, easily be applied to other time periods in other places. So I think really awareness is the key here. I think bringing that awareness fully to the history of architecture is key. This actually reminds me of something I saw only just today. I was skimming through the BBC website, and I saw a report on a project that was being developed by the Prado Museum in Madrid and the WWF, the World Wildlife Fund. They had taken some of the key paintings in their collection and adapted them to this is in an attempt to raise awareness of climate change. And I did this rather quite literally. So this is how, as it were, history of art is wading into this debate. So they start with these famous paintings, this one by Velázquez, and they do things like this to it. This is quite literal in your face, but again, it's about raising awareness. I think it's quite effective in doing that kind of thing. So there's this famous painting, another one, this one by Goya, of course becomes this, the climate refugees and so on in the future. This one becomes this. And there are a number of others they did this procedure with famous paintings. Of course, architecture needs no sort of adaptation in this way. As you'll know from the recent floods in Venice, famous buildings are also being inundated with water. Record floods in Venice, highest level since 50 years. Could be a one-off, but it may not be. So the time will tell. I think again, awareness is key, and I think bringing this to all facets of architectural education, I think is very important. So, onto the topic proper now. From the early 18th century onwards, coal, of course, became increasingly important as a source of energy, especially in Britain. Initially used as a substitute for wood, it quickly proved its effectiveness at intense heat transfer. So coal's high energy density per unit mass meant that once conditions for its controlled and efficient combustion had been established, it would become the principal energy source for industrialisation. Such had coal's dominance become by the middle of the 19th century that in 1865, at the height of Victorian industrial transformation, the noted English economist Stanley Jevons declared it to be quote unquote all powerful, that it stood quote not beside but entirely above all other commodities, end quote, being the motive power that underpinned the British economy. Coal had become the factor, not a factor, not one factor, but the factor, as you can see, in everything we do. Now, given the available evidence regarding energy consumption during the Victorian period, Jevons' observation is no exaggeration. Despite this economic reality, it's easy for those concerned with the history of architecture to forget just how important coal had become to the British building industry by this time, and the contingent effects it had on building design and production. Indeed, it would not be unreasonable to suggest that one of the key characteristics, or in fact defining features of the Victorian building world, was its direct and exponential reliance upon a ready and abundant supply of coal-fired energy. Without this supply of coal, architecture in the Victorian age would have looked very, very different. And whatever it did look like, it's safe to say that it would have been on a much reduced scale. This suggests that the story of Victorian architecture may, in part at least, be understood as the story of the relatively new and especially intense relationship between architecture and energy in the form of the industrial scale combustion of coal. In order to make sense of this relationship, we must, I think, first address the commodity or the input itself, coal. Essentially, as you'll know, coal is but the carbonisation under intense heat and pressure of dead plant matter. As an economist would define it, coal is therefore a stock as opposed to a flow of energy resulting from the capture of solar radiation through the process of plant photosynthesis. Its chemical composition, particularly anthracite, which is one of its purest forms, is approximately 92 to 98% pure carbon. Therefore, when one speaks of an age of coal, as Stanley Jevons does here, one is effectively announcing the rise to dominance of what today we would call the carbon economy. To illustrate this point, one need only chart the rise of coal consumption in Britain during the modern era. By the 1850s, coal represented an incredible 92% of all annual energy use per capita in England and Wales, compared to just 10% in the 1560s or 40% in the first decade of the 18th century. More striking still is the jump from 61% in the 1750s, the very beginning of that technological transformation referred to as the Industrial Revolution. And I think this, then graphically, this graph really does illustrate the dramatic rise in the, of coal's input to the British economy and energy use at this time. So this reliance on coal as a key energy input during the Victorian age not only had significant consequences for architectural production, but also, and more importantly, for how we understand buildings as material objects. This material dimension is important, but one that is, I think, often forgotten about or neglected in architectural history. It does not concern really the notion of materials in a sort of traditional, straightforward or conventional sense as components of assembly, but rather the idea of substance instead, what might otherwise be termed architecture's ontology. And what this essentially means is that when considering the relationship between architecture and energy with respect to materiality, we must concern ourselves primarily with process, that is procurement and production. Take, for example, a building material such as the simple, humble brick. The fact that a building be made of brick is in one sense neither here nor there. It's more important, or perhaps more pertinent, to inquire into the very nature of that brick. Although the bricks in two different buildings or two different architectures may look superficially similar or indeed the same, they may differ radically in terms of the way they were procured. In other words, how do such bricks differ as a matter of substance? Handmade, unfired, or wood-fired bricks versus machine-made, coal-fired bricks, for example. It's this basic difference in nature that fundamentally distinguishes much so-called Victorian architecture, let's say post-1830s, from what preceded it, despite whatever stylistic similarities may be evident. This fundamental distinction marks out what I think is the true difference between these phenomena, a difference in which energy inputs are absolutely crucial. Now, experiments in machine-powered brick manufacturing had not only increased output substantially by the 1850s, but it also created the conditions for an improved supply of better quality bricks made to reliable standards of form, colour, density, hardness, and of course non-porosity, compared to the progressively patchy quality of handmade bricks or handmade equivalents. Consequently, a substantive and measurable difference began to open up between handmade and machine-produced bricks in Victorian Britain. Developments in coal-fired kiln technology also made for far greater scales of efficiency in terms of evenness and thoroughness of burn, producing less wastage in the process. And these transformations led, in turn, to an equal divergence between hand and machine-made products, which, with respect to their aesthetic attributes, as bricks became smoother, more consistent, and what brickies would call truer. Ironically, this aesthetic difference is something that critics of machine-produced brick highlights, and people like from the arts and crafts movement pointed to this very sort of, as I say, smooth or true finish of bricks, which was so different from the handmade equivalents. Now, the location of brickworks, in fact, along railway lines, likewise facilitated transportation of both energy inputs at one end, coal, and finished products at the other, putting such works across the country in reasonable economic striking distance of major markets in the southeast and elsewhere, including the major industrial cities of the Midlands and the North. Although in many cases this added to the cost at point of delivery, it was generally considered the price worth paying. This applies especially to the growing taste among Victorian architects and their clients for polychromatic effect in architecture, requiring a variety of different coloured bricks from a number of locations. Take, for instance, William Butterfield's insistence on using quality black bricks from Cowbridge in Wales on his famous church All Saints Margaret Street in London for an astonishing £4 per 1,000. This is like 20 or 30 times more expensive than ordinary bricks. That's because these black bricks from Cowbridge were burnt black all the way through. If you broke them in half, they were black all the way through. Whereas traditional black bricks were just a surface treatment which could weather off, would be scratched off. So he was after quality and his client, and he would pay the price for that type of brick, and it came from a long way away, transported by rail. To be sure, a demand for locally produced handmade bricks never ceased, of course, and disagreements over the best methods for machine production also continued or rumbled away, but mechanisation of the industry was all but complete by the end of the 19th century. Therefore, in considering the relationship between architecture and energy, we must, I think, first contend with buildings as objects before considering what they might mean or represent. After all, many of the peculiarities we observe in the phenomenon of Victorian architecture, or at least what made them possible, the vastly increased scale, precision, material complexity, and frequency of buildings of all kinds, really pertains more to architecture's ontology than to its meaning. The implications that coal-fired mechanisation had for the building industry in 19th century Britain were evident across the sector, not just in brick production. Take iron, for instance. There would have been no so-called iron problem in 1850s Britain, or indeed British architectural discourse, without iron. And there would have been no iron on any significant scale or quantity at least, without efficient production processes driven by industrial scale coal-fired furnace technology. Nor would there have been any concern over the social and psychological melees caused by mass production in architecture without the advances in mechanisation that resulted from the efficient harnessing of steam power, itself only made possible, again, or on any significant scale, by the effective transferal of heat energy through the controlled combustion of coal. Nor would there have been any talk of making use of richer and harder wearing materials, such as marble and granite, to any extent in Victorian architecture without vast improvements in speedy and efficient steam-powered transportation technology, and of course, steam-driven cutting and polishing machinery. Indeed, one might go so far as to say, I think, that the very idea of the High Victorian would not have arisen without easy and relatively cheap access to modern transport infrastructure. An infrastructure that the famous architect George Street so aptly observed gave the middle-class professional no excuse at all not to familiarise himself with continental art. Moreover, once the inspiration of continental art had been realised, its effective and widespread dissemination within the British architectural community through high-volume book and periodical production would likewise not have been possible without the steam-powered printing press and the coming of the so-called Second Print Revolution. What is evident, I think, in all of this is the advent of a new and I think quite peculiar kind of architectural ecology, material and intellectual, one in which virtually every constituent element, process and connection is not only disparate but also dependent upon a ready and abundant supply of energy in the form of coal. This constituted a production environment founded on increasing demands for speed and quantity. In this regard alone, Victorian architecture by the 1850s and 1860s was in many ways was as different or more so from, say, Georgian architecture of around the year 1800 as Georgian architecture was from the pyramids of ancient Egypt or the temples of Abyssinia. So I think the transformation was that rapid and that radical, the difference was that great. Another way to understand what is meant by ecology in this sense is to think of it as akin to how geographers and anthropologists of infrastructure use the term technological zone. A technological zone is both a physical and an intellectual space in which technological practices, procedures and forms of knowledge not only coalesce through cumulative degrees of productive codependency. In other words, think about this relationship between the coal mine, the railway, the steam engine and the industrial furnace, but also where the differences between these have been reduced and common standards have been established. Zoning of this kind is typical, of course, in industrial regimes where fields of qualification necessarily emerge that connect producers with consumers, knitting them into a steadily increasing regulatory framework in which industrial products and processes may be assessed and compared with one another, and through which, therefore, certain economic and political strategies can be reliably planned and also realised. The increasing standards, quality and scale observable in Victorian architecture mentioned that I've just been talking about are the result of the performance, the working of zones of this kind. These zones required both technologies and infrastructures to operate effectively, with the infrastructure pulling the various technologies, again both instrumental and intellectual, together to form a series of interlocking systems that created a wider ecology. Now, this architectural ecology was emergent in the sense that it was pegged to, and therefore the outcome of compound, or what you might call compound technology feedback loops. Ultimately, once Watt's steam engine had proven its utility in the efficient propulsion of machinery, an ideology, indeed a fetishization of steam became prevalent, ushering in inescapable regimes of time and scale against which all economy was measured, positively or negatively, including in architecture. Why this initially occurred in Britain rather than elsewhere involved, as to be said, some luck. There was a readily accessible abundance of coal in the British Isles, but this was coincident with a high wage economy in comparison to other parts of Europe and Asia during the 18th and 19th centuries. The cheap supply of energy in Britain therefore incentivized British business to invent technology that effectively substituted energy for labour. As Britain's success in the wider global economy increased over time, including imperial expansion, wages and living standards also climbed relative to competing nations, therefore exerting sustained demand within the local economy for technological solutions that utilised these cheap and apparently inexhaustible supplies of energy. Indeed, and again to turn to George Street, that famous architect, he reckoned at the time, and I quote, "Surely all our facilities of locomotion, of friendly intercourse and acquaintance with foreign lands, and the like, are so many points in which we have a great advantage." End quote. Therefore, you might say that steam power reordered nature rather than responding to the world as given. From then on, advanced economies began to shape themselves around the opportunities and demands of steam power. As I was saying, the effective moment for this key transformation was around the year 1830. Owing to the proliferation of industrial processes and networks of transportation that ensued, mainstream architectural practice became a vastly different phenomenon. So, in a relatively short period of time, architectural practices became noticeably larger, much larger. They became more organised and technologically orientated. Again, as George Street observed, and I quote, "No architecture can be the best which is content to forego the use of the great mechanical advantages and inventions of our age." End quote. Those architects that would succeed in this brave new world would fully appreciated this transformation. Some well-known architects like William Butterfield, for example, were of course still concerned to employ local materials when and where they could, especially in rural contexts, but less so in urban contexts. But others, like Alfred Waterhouse, fully embraced the new industrial regime and the opportunities for architectural invention that it afforded. Now, Waterhouse's extensive use of machine manufactured products, such as terracotta and encaustic tiling, are evident in most of his major commissions, including Manchester Town Hall, the Natural History Museum in London, and of course the Prudential Assurance Building, also in London. And based on some of the outline observations I've just made, I think it's useful perhaps to take a bit of a step back and think of these transformations, initially at least, with respect to economics. The advent of what we now call Victorian architecture stands at the tipping point of the most dramatic and disruptive transformation in human history, the consequences of the full and effective harnessing of steam power. This transformation in Britain resulted from nothing less than the fundamental shift from an organic, fungible economy, that is the type of economy that characterised and limited all human societies up to that point, whether they be advanced European or primitive or nomadic, what have you. So it transformed them from organic and fungible, to a mineral-based consumptive economy. This was a fundamental shift. Crucially, energy consumption, and therefore productivity, was limited in organic economies owing to the relative ineffectiveness of access to and the harnessing of flows and stocks of photosynthesized solar energy, what economists call the production horizon. Such economies were limited in particular by their inability to translate this energy efficiently into mechanical force. So in other words, much of this energy dissipated or was wasted through bodily maintenance, whether human or animal, before it could be utilised effectively. Photosynthesized energy stocks, such as timber, were also limited to the availability of and access to sustainably managed woodlands. So this flow of energy, that is the solar energy, and its effective use was highly constrained, forming an impediment to exponential economic growth. Organic economies effectively had a ceiling beyond which they could not progress. This is something that the famous economists, David Ricardo, Adam Smith, they all realised this, they all knew about it, but they knew of no effective alternative to it. However, economies founded on fossil fuel consumption, in this case coal, faced no such limitations, other than coal being a finite resource. Again, this represented nothing less than an energy revolution, reaching, as mentioned, its full potential with the efficient harnessing of steam power in the second quarter of the 19th century. The massive carbonised stocks of accumulated photosynthesis that an abundant supply of coal represented made available potentially billions of so-called ghost acres from what R.P. Serfel has termed the Great Subterranean Forest, I think this statistic here at the top is very telling. If the British economy was to rely on timber alone, you can see it would have required 150% of its own land mass to reach the equivalent of the burning of coal at the same time. Just goes to show how important coal was to the British economy. Now, the conceptual leap in terms of industrial science and technological innovation was equally significant. As the economic historian Joel Mokyr has remarked, the equivalence between heat, that is thermal energy, and work, or kinetic energy, was not suspected by people in the 18th century. In other words, the notion that a horse pulling a treadmill and a coal-fired heating and lime kiln were in some sense doing the same thing would have appeared absurd to them. So alongside factors of resource abundance, accessibility, and processes of exploitation were the large-scale efficiencies to be gained from the economical transformation of huge quantities of energy, providing strong incentives to invest in canal and railway construction. Therefore, with the heavy investment in railway lines in the 1830s and 40s in Britain, by the time of the Great Exhibition of 1851, an embryonic rail network of over 6,000 miles was already in place. As the economic historian E.A. Wrigley concluded, and I quote, "The building of a rail network in England symbolised the fact that mechanical energy, no less than heat energy, could be secured as required from coal." End quote. In many ways, the Victorian building world was a byproduct of the advent of this system and its ecology of energy extraction, transportation, and consumption. A useful way to consider what this might mean architecturally, and therefore allow us to comprehend better the radical distinction between Victorian architecture and its preceding manifestations, is to think about building assemblage via what sustainability experts call the embodied energy of building production and life cycle analytics, or in what layman's terms these days we would refer to as a building's carbon footprint. Embodied energy may be taken as specifically, and here I'm quoting from the Dictionary of Energy, I quote, so embodied energy is, quote, the sum of the energy requirements associated, directly or indirectly, with the delivery of a good or a service, end quote. This includes the energy embodied in individual building components, such as the energy required to extract the raw materials, so that is, so to quarry stone, for example, process them, assemble them into usable products, and then, of course, transport them to site, as well as the energy required to assemble those same components once on site. When thinking about the materiality of Victorian architecture, we tend to forget, for example, just how crucially the development of the Victorian stone industry, to take one example, relied on these technologies and networks, and therefore just how much embodied energy its products contained. The rather sudden appearance of a hitherto near unattainable array of decorative and common building stones, not just from within Britain, but from across Europe and indeed the Mediterranean basin, in quantities and of quality and at a cost that made them available for general use for the first time, was entirely dependent upon a particular input of energy, whether in terms of new steam-driven cutting and polishing technology, or reliable steamship transportation, or indeed the laying out of higher speed and higher capacity rail networks. This applied as much to marble and granite as to other common building stones. And again, this is something that was fully acknowledged and fully realised at the time. For example, Alexander James Beresford Hope, who was a leading ecclesiologist, leading theorist of architecture in the Victorian age, and indeed the patron of this wonderful building, All Saints Margaret Street by William Butterfield. He observed at the time, so in 1861, he said, and I quote, the application of coloured material, marble, brick, and so on, both to the main features and the decorative details of buildings, is every day coming into vogue with a fullness which never could have been compassed while the steam engine was still unknown, end quote. What this points to is a fundamentally new dynamic in which disparate events and processes and even technologies, which seen in isolation from one another may have seemed unimportant, perhaps not even connected, suddenly coalesce with one another. And as Siegfried Gideon would say, they coalesce with explosive force at this moment in time. And I think, again, this is the effects of zoning, this idea of zoning I mentioned earlier. So again, this is the tipping point that really opened up a whole new world of possibilities in architecture, not just for the buildings themselves, but through involvement in the process at every step along the chain of production. The increased speed and frequency of movement that resulted from this effect was one of the key features of the energy revolution resulting from the industrial scale combustion of coal during the Victorian age. Therefore, what I think really distinguishes Victorian architecture vis-a-vis the new carbon economy is that it is fundamentally and at base an architecture of energy and movement. If not the first architecture of energy and movement, at least the most vigorous and disruptive that the world had yet experienced. Architectural production during this period, on the whole, may be considered so much the byproduct of steam power, and in particular the movement on a previously unimagined scale. Think of it. Materials coming from far away, procured under increasingly mechanized conditions, entailing the consumption of fossil fuel energy in huge quantities. When we consider further what we call Victorian architecture in this context, we must understand it as a peculiar outcome of that technological shift. Let me finish with a representative example of this, I think a good one. By the leading Victorian architect, George Gilbert Scott, his famous St Pancras Station in London, which is a building I'm sure all of you will know. Now, this building was the London terminus for the Midland Railway Company. The materials for both the main hotel building itself and the adjoining shed at the back came from right across Britain, but largely from the Midlands, where that company had its headquarters. So the facing portion of the building, the 60 million bricks or so used for that, came from Nottinghamshire and Leicestershire, while the stone used included red Mansfield stone from Nottinghamshire, Kenton and Ancas stone, with Shap and Peterhead varieties of granite coming all the way from Scotland. The ironwork came from, so at the back of the main hotel has ironwork in it itself, but also, of course, the train shed at the back, if you've ever seen that. You can see from this image on the right-hand side, the steel ribs going up. So the ironwork for that came from the Butterley Company in Ripley in Derbyshire, while slate roofing was bought all the way from Wales and Charnwood in Leicestershire. Coal-fired industrial machinery and processes were employed throughout. Even for the common bricks used in the building's substructure, which were produced not far away, just down the road, were produced at a rate of 60,000 per day using extrusion machines and an on-site Hoffman kiln. So in this respect, the St Pancras Station complex, both in its material variety and consequent aesthetic quality, was the veritable embodiment of industrial zoning and its networked connectivity. None of this is necessary to suggest, I should add, that the connection between architecture and energy was merely taken for granted or viewed uncritically in the Victorian age. The association between fossil fuel consumption, industrial production, and architecture were, as mentioned, well understood. And there were some people, of course, for various reasons, who were extremely wary of it. For example, John Ruskin For him, the mining and the combustion of coal had manifold moral consequences with respect to idleness, rampant consumerism, and therefore the discipline of desire. Pollution too, of course, was a key concern. We all hear stories about Victorian Britain being covered in fog and smog and soot and all the rest of it. Later, misgivings over industrial manufacturing and its effects on craftsmanship would become the cause célèbre of William Morris and the arts and crafts movement, who sought, as it were, to sort of strike a pose against the regrettable consequences of the new energy-rich carbon-based economy. But again, none of this really changed the facts on the ground, and the doubting of Ruskin and others was largely a sort of pushing against the tide, the insuperable tide, actually, of technological progress. Ultimately, the transfer of Britain from an organic economy to an industrialised fossil fuel-based one established the conditions for the emergence of an infrastructural system that worked to create a technological zone for the production and supply of building materials. This was itself part of a larger zone of manufacturing and transportation infrastructure relating to the Victorian building world as a whole, but one that obviously required a certain quantum of energy input in order to be both economic and sustainable. As a result, a new architectural reality evolved, increasingly fast, linear, punctiform, and thus efficient systems of modern production characterised this new carbon-rich economy, as large amounts of machine-produced material were procured and transported from point to point via rail, steamer, and so on, increasing not only quality and quantity, generally speaking, but also significantly reducing time and cost. Therefore, in understanding the relationship between architecture and energy in the Victorian period, we would do well, I think, to consider architecture from this, as it were, thermodynamic and therefore ontological perspective. So, as a word, just gives you a kind of snapshot of what, how I think architectural history can deal with this nexus between architecture and energy. We talk a lot about it today, but I think, again, we don't tend to talk much about it historically, or at least analyse it the way it should be historically. So I hope, again, my modest contribution this evening demonstrates how this kind of thing might be done. Not just in the Victorian period, but any sort of period in architectural history. I'll leave it there. Thank you.